wow, is Trump about to go full, George W. Bush in this conflict? And I think it just goes to show that what he's doing, he probably doesn't even know the degree of like global panic that it sets off.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. After a few days of absolute chaos coming out of the Trump administration, we're going to speak to White House correspondent Emily Jashinsky from Unherd, who speaks to us about how the media is reacting to Trump's comments that Zelenskyy is a dictator, whether Donald Trump is losing his leader of the free world title, and whether this all comes down to one man's ego. Today on the Trump Report. Emily Jashinsky, White House reporter for Unherd. Thank you for joining the Trump Report. You've had a busy week. I mean, anyone covering Donald Trump for a living has had a busy week. But we're going to kickstart in just 48 hours. Donald Trump has flipped the narrative when it comes to Zelenskyy, and it seems like he's made an enemy. How dangerous do you think this situation is right now?
Yeah, it's interesting because we see a lot of Trump's Republican allies trying to clean up what he said and indicate, he's frustrated. Like Mike Waltz, director of National Security Advisor, saying he's frustrated by Zelenskyy not going along with the mineral proposal, which the Trump administration has been trying to negotiate with Zelenskyy. I think the Telegraph referred to it as, quote, full economic colonization of Ukraine on behalf of the U.S. So you can see why Zelenskyy wouldn't immediately just sort of fold on that question. But that's the explanation we're getting from people in Trump world, is that he's frustrated with Zelenskyy, and that sort of volcanic eruption that took place over the course of 24 hours, first in some comments that he made from behind a podium, and then really with the tweet, I should say the post on Truth Social that kicked everything off, was apparently springing from a deep frustration with Zelensky's unwillingness to go along with the Trump peace proposal. So it is dangerous to the extent that right now, it looks like Zelenskyy has lost a significant amount of leverage. So if you're Zelenskyy, this is, it's a terrible week for you, except for that, the bright side, you've had so many people rally behind you.
Absolutely. And this peace agreement, this contract that Trump said Zelenskyy was pretty insane, basically wanting about $500 billion worth of repayment, including those rare earth minerals. But yes, he's basically said he's not accepting it, really, which has prompted this war of words. But Emily, Trump called Zelenskyy a dictator. Pretty strong words, and said that he started this war in Ukraine. What has the reaction been from the media, and especially, White House media that you're surrounded with every day?
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of what happened back in 2017 when Donald Trump first took office, and people realized that everyone kind of knew this would be the case, but actually as the president of the United States, he was sort of freewheeling in the same way he did as a reality television host, as someone outside of politics. He doesn't, there's no distinction for him between when he's president and when he's not. He just talks like this. And so it reminds me, again, so much of how you just have to, as a journalist, you have to stop and completely rethink every story, everything, and talk to people in Trump world and say, is this something that needs to be taken seriously, or is this something that needs to be taken literally? The distinction a lot of journalists used to think about everything that Trump does, because if it's taken literally, that totally changes the tone for his administration. On the other hand, we know that he has people like Keith Kellogg, his envoy in this case, around him who are serious. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who have come, Trump himself has not always talked about Zelenskyy as a dictator. So he has these personality-based relationships with other countries, where it's his relationship with the other leader. And, it doesn't change the drama of the escalation in the rhetoric, but it does look, I guess, from the perspective of if you put yourself in Trump's shoes, he's probably trying to create leverage. He's probably trying to back Zelenskyy into a corner, but you don't really know. You just have to talk to people around him.
Yeah, it does seem like the narrative has shifted, though, for Trump, in the sense that quite a number of people did put so much hope in him thinking that he was the guy that was going to get this job done, especially with the way he spoke, that he said he was the guy that's going to get this done. But in this last 48 to 24 hours period, it does feel like there has been a shift in backing the way he's handled these negotiations and handled the way he's been publicly speaking, to the point where very pro-Trump, media outlets and commentators online have, taken a step back and not agreed with what he had to say. I wonder, Emily, has Trump's ego lost him the support and the backing of the media?
I would say probably not, because he is still, like, Ukraine in the United States is so low on the average conservative or the average Trump supporters list of concerns. They see him as someone who will make their material life better. And Ukraine, we could talk about how Ukraine is important for energy resources and all of that do change the material lives of people in America, but it's not really seen as a kitchen table issue here. So one of the things I've observed just over the last 48, 24 hours, as you mentioned, is people sort of saying, this is wrong, he's not correct in this, but not seeing it as a red line. Among like conservative media figures who are typically pro-Trump. I think a lot of people look at this and say, okay, so he's trying to, this is the quote-unquote art of the deal for him. That's how he sees this. Doesn't necessarily make it correct. Obviously, Ukraine did not start the war, but he's trying to negotiate with Zelenskyy, and that's how it came out. So because it's not a big kitchen table issue, I think he's probably safe. But when it does come to kitchen table issues, this type of, I guess, volcanic rhetoric, that would be genuinely very damaging.
Yeah, and the thing that was agreed on a bipartisan level, and I guess across America and with allies across the world, would be that they wanted the war to end. No one wants the US to be spending this much money. No one wants Europe to be spending this much money protecting a sovereign country. So it's not a complicated matter in that regard. People thought if Donald Trump's going to get the job done, he's going to broker this negotiation. Who cares who does it? But I think Donald Trump coming out and calling Zelenskyy a dictator was kind of a different way to go down. And I wonder, Emily, if a reporter is basically going to ask Donald Trump eventually, is it not dictatorial to be calling someone a dictator for wanting the best for their country?
Well, he's increasingly putting himself in a situation where he's going to get those questions, because over the course of the last week, the White House put out a Time magazine cover with him wearing a crown and saying something to the extent of, like, long live the king. And several days before that, he had said, he who saves his country, this is like a quote, a paraphrasing of Napoleon, breaks no law. So he's going to start getting a lot of questions about that. So just period, he's going to start getting a lot of questions about that. But yeah, he did campaign. This is worth remembering. He campaigned so heavily on peace. And even going back to his first campaign, it was so focused on peace, on ending conflict, and getting good deals for America. And I think he sees Ukraine through the lens of getting a good deal for America. But what America wants to see is actually peace. And America still is incredibly skeptical of Putin. For example, like, you do hear people in right-wing spaces talk about Zelenskyy as a dictator. One person in particular who does use that phrase is Tucker Carlson. Most recently in his interview with Piers Morgan, they debated that really heavily. So maybe that's something that Trump kind of pulled from Tucker and Tucker World. But the average American is pretty skeptical of Vladimir Putin. They don't think about Vladimir Putin often, but to the extent they do, they definitely don't want to see the United States looking like it's appeasing Putin, if that were to be the ultimate solution.
Because right now, I think in those first month or the first 3 weeks of his presidency, it did seem like he was approaching this as if Putin was a dictator, as if he was an enemy, but one in which he could deal with, he could slay this enemy. But his language as of late hasn't been condemnation. It's been, kind of I guess, praising him in a certain way, while not treating him like some people would. But it's been quite a contested issue, especially in these last 2 days. Mike Pence basically disagreed. He said, Mr. President, Ukraine did not start the war. That is a common theme on social media. online across whatever thing you're reading, whether it's right-wing media, left-wing media, most people agree Donald Trump was wrong. Ukraine did not start this war. And then you have Charles Kupperman comparing him to Neville Chamberlain, and then Dmitry Medvedev, who was a senior advisor to Putin, saying, if you told me just 3 months ago that these would be the words of the US president, I would have laughed out loud and said Trump is 200% right. Now, my question for you, is it time for Trump to be acknowledging that he needs to be listening to members of Congress from both sides of the aisle and perhaps consider, is Putin playing him like a fiddle?
Well, that's the one thing that if they start telling him, if he starts hearing from Republican senators that he is looking like he's getting played by Putin, that's obviously a way to, and if the media starts talking about it through that framework, that's obviously a way to get under Donald Trump's skin and probably change his behavior. If that starts to become what it looks like. Now, he does, again, it's possible we're looking back on this in 2 weeks and he gets some version of the mineral deal out of Zelenskyy and parties agree to some type of ceasefire, and maybe a month from now we're looking at this and saying, okay, so Trump was just trying to get Zelenskyy to the table. Again, it doesn't make it right, but he's so personality based when he has these negotiations. And to the point that you just made, I think it is really important that he was talking about Putin in a way that some of the realist skeptics of neoconservatism who have put themselves behind Trump we're like, wow, is Trump about to go full, George W. Bush in this conflict? And I think it just goes to show that what he's doing, he probably doesn't even know the degree of global panic that it sets off. He is acting like he's just negotiating a business deal with these guys. And that's, again, it sounds like a charitable spin on what Trump is doing, but I honestly think that it's the truth. It doesn't make it right, but I think it's just the best way to explain how he sees this. And your point about whether he's getting played by Putin, I know that he's hearing from Republican senators. I know that he's getting calls from them. And if they start explaining that to him, we could definitely see a change.
Well, that was my next question, because I spoke to American businessman Bill Browder earlier in the week, who had just been to the Munich Security Conference, and his entire takeaway from his 3 days there, that he spoke to numerous members of Congress across both sides of the political aisle, and he said, this is bipartisan. They're in agreement that they don't agree with the way Donald Trump is interacting with Vladimir Putin, how he's taking his message to the world stage. So when you're on Capitol Hill and you're, running around doing your interviews and speaking to members of the Republican, members of the Democratic Party, as well as any constituents, are you hearing the same vibe?
I think Republicans try to do this privately with Trump because they don't want to publicly look like they're condemning Trump or hysterical over Trump, because again, it's just not a kitchen table issue for most of their voters. Most of their voters don't see it that way. But one way they do communicate with Trump is through TV. So, I think you see them going on Fox News and talking in a very particular way. I know that they're in touch with the White House about all of this and are, saying, and some of them, it's people like Roger Wicker, who was really upset about how Pete Hegseth communicated in Brussels last week. So some of it is kind of old guard Republicans that don't really agree with Trump on much. So they don't have a ton of sway, but somebody like Lindsey Graham, Trump does listen to him. And I'm sure that they've had conversations where Lindsey Graham is trying to persuade him that he's the one who looks weak.
I wonder, because a recent poll from the Quinnipiac University just came out yesterday, and Donald Trump's approval rating has dropped by quite a bit since the end of January. It's only, not even a month later. His approval is now 45%, disapproval's 49%, but in late January, his approval was 46%, his disapproval was 43%. Can this be attributed, this drop, this near 4 to 5% drop, to the way that he's handling Putin? Because this is the main subject that he's been dealing with in the past 3 weeks.
It's possible. I think a lot of it also probably comes from Doge, and different polls have found different things. But not entirely unusual. CBS News had a poll recently that had his approval over 50%, which is interesting compared to the Quinnipiac one. But the Quinnipiac one does show movement. It shows downward movement, and my suspicion is that most of it would come from localities that are affected by some of these big slashes to federal spending. People realizing that the Veterans Hospital in their community was cut, and this person they know who works there doesn't have a job anymore. I think that's probably what most of it is. But to the extent this continues, it's not impossible. I mean, people just don't like chaos, and this definitely feeds into that narrative of chaos. We've seen Democrats start referring to Trump as, quote, Captain Chaos. That's Hakeem Jeffries' new name for him. But they've probably thought significantly about that because it's something that voters react to, and this definitely feeds into that.
And the way he's governing, Emily, it's not surprising to anyone. The US has had the luxury of 4 years before this to know the way he operates, but quite a number of people, including world leaders, have said that he's a lot, bossier, a lot more. I don't even know how to explain it. He's a different kind of guy. He wants to get things done so quickly because he knows he only has 4 years. So that's why he's signing these executive orders in his first few weeks, because he wants everything to be done quickly. He told Sean Hannity he wants it done quickly so it can eventually be codified into law. But a final question for you. Now, we have European leaders. We have world leaders across the globe. We have allies like Canada and Australia and France holding emergency summits or directly reaching out to Zelenskyy to let him know that they've got his back, as well as publicly denouncing Trump's comments. Australia is one of the biggest allies, and so is the UK, and they're coming out saying we do not agree with Donald Trump's comments that Zelenskyy is a dictator, nor do we believe that he needs to be holding an election at a time when Ukraine is going through martial law. I wonder, has Donald Trump in these last few days started to lose his title as leader of the free world?
Well, if to the extent that that becomes something he hears from people, he may be really sensitive to that. Australia is a great point because he's right now, and a lot of people in his circles, a lot of people in his foreign policy circles are very concerned about Taiwan and China. And Australia is incredibly critical to that relationship. And so some people in Trump circles, like intellectual Trump circles, will say they don't want America to look like the leader of the free world anymore. They want a hemispheric dominance. They just want America to sort of stay home and dominate the hemisphere in a way that creates prosperity for the average American. Others, though, totally disagree with that. And if you ask the average American, they probably do want America to remain the leader of the free world. And so I think it's a sensitive thing with Donald Trump because he wants to look like the leader of the free world. He wants to look like the man who's in charge of everything. And those relationships with allies really matter. And so I think, to the point you just made, that's probably what people like Lindsey Graham and Tom Cotton, Republican senators, and even Speaker Mike Johnson are probably pitching to Trump behind the scenes when they want to sort of nudge him to tamp down the rhetoric publicly. Even if he's doing it as negotiation, they're going to tell him, like, it ends up putting America in a weaker position.
But do you think that this all comes back to his ego?
Most things do. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think this is the interesting thing about Donald Trump is that it's all very, he does treat geopolitics not in this sort of egg-headed, wonky policy way, but more similar to like business deals and personality-based international relations. So that's why, when people, Trump actually did a lot of things that were not pro-Putin in his first term in office, but people thought he was pro-Putin because of the way he talked to Putin publicly and talked about Putin publicly. We saw him do a similar thing with Kim Jong-un. Like he just does this because he thinks ultimately it's helpful to get them to give up some stuff that's good for America. And he thinks he can do it. And so it does kind of come down to Trump's like swagger and bravado that he can do it. He can create peace in Ukraine in 24 hours. That's something he campaigned on. So yeah, I think there's something to that for sure.
Emily Jashinsky, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.